I'm Steve McDonald, the Director of the Africa Program and the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity. So I want to welcome you here this morning. It's a remarkable turnout for a lovely, lovely summer day in the middle of August. So we know that you're dedicated followers of Nigeria, of the economic situation in Africa, and are ready to hear what we think is going to be an outstanding presentation. Of course, we're welcoming Kingsley Moghalu, who's the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and he will be. We've asked Carl Levan, who directs the Africa program at the American University. At International Service, School of International Service, to provide us some responding remarks after Kingsley finishes with his presentation. But let me start first of all by thanking allafrica.com, and Tammy and Reed are in the audience here with us, because it was really their initiative that brought Kingsley to us and helped us to arrange this meeting today, which I think is going to be very useful. And so they're co-sponsoring the event with us, and we thank you very much for all of your efforts in this behalf. I also want to recognize, of course, Ambassador Seydou Bouda, who's the ambassador to the United States for Burkina Faso. We always want to recognize our diplomatic corps when they're here. So welcome, Ambassador Bouda. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. As you know, because it was in the flyer that you received, but he's got, of course, a very long history of involvement. Not only is he Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, but he's in charge of the Financial System Stability Directorate and supervises a number of departments of the Central Bank of Nigeria. He's got a long history of government service. But, of course, one of the things that's attracted us to him right now is his recent book, Emerging Africa: How the Global Economy's Last Frontier Can Prosper and Matter. Obviously, on the heels of President Obama's recent trip, on the negotiations and discussions that are going on around the AGOA renewal, the African Growth and Opportunities Act renewal here in Washington, economic issues are very much on everyone's mind as we think about Africa. It is being called often the new frontier, but how realistic is that? How sustainable is that? What other things need to go into the mix to make that actually happen? We know the potential. All of us who've worked in Africa for years, as I have for the last 43 years, know the great potential of Africa. But what do you need to do to really realize that? And I think you're going to find some really insightful comments from Kingsley on this, and obviously you probably want to get his book, which will elaborate on it even further. So I always make my part of these discussions very short. We will be following up with a lengthy question and answer period. We are being webcast live, also covered by a couple of other media outlets. So we will give you the rules on that when we get to the Q&A, when I begin to moderate the session. But with no further ado, let me ask Kingsley to come to the podium.
Thank you. Steve, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Very highly honored that you had nothing better to do on this summer morning than to come and listen to me talk about Africa. It's really an honor, and thank you very much for being here. Steve had already done a couple of recognitions. Where I come from, we're very big on recognitions, but I'll save you your time. But there's just one I have to do, and that's to introduce most recently the Minister of State for Health of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, a very good friend of mine, Dr. Mohammed Ali Pate, who's here as well. He will be joining the faculty of Duke University as a professor of global health this fall. So I thought I should mention Mohammed's presence, and as we say back home, all other protocols observed. Now, I think Africa has caught the imagination of the world in recent times, not as a basket case, not with kids with flies on their mouths and protruded bellies, but as part of the world where people can legitimately aspire to be prosperous, just like many other parts of the world, as a part of the world that has opportunities, as a part of the world where business can be done and good money made. In short, a normal part of the world. And that's good. About time too. Now, but I think we all who are interested in Africa, who love Africa, we all have a responsibility, first of all, to Africa, for Africa's sake, to be sure to interrogate a number of conventional wisdoms that have come out of what I call the new brand Africa that has emerged in the last, shall we say 10 years, but certainly most recently 5 years. And so we've seen quite a lot of books about Africa rising, about Africa's time, about Africa's turn, and there's a lot of good feelings going around. That's fine. But as I said in the book, it's important to interrogate these conventional wisdoms. And for reasons that I will advance later on, to say that Africa is at an important inflection point. Africa is at a point that I would describe as a fork in the road. And so it can go this way or that way. It's at a point of promise. It's at a point of opportunity. But Africa hasn't risen yet. Let's be clear. I'm not here to give you some feel-good message like some insurance salesman about how wonderful things have become or will soon become in Africa. I'm here to give you a hard-headed, realistic, and I believe informed insight into Africa's economic prospects in the context of the world economy and in the context of globalization. Now, I want to start my discussion by taking off from the point of the topic of this discussion, and that is Africa as the last frontier, why it matters to the global economy or to the world economy. And I'll do that in two tranches. The first is to talk about the whole point or the whole phrase of Africa as the last frontier. And then I'll talk about why Africa matters in the world economy. And so the first question is, what is Africa as the last frontier? If you look at the book that I have just written called Emerging Africa, how the global economy's last frontier can prosper and matter, I think from the title you will also see that the last Africa as the last frontier is in inverted commas, it's in quotes. And so that raises the question of whose last frontier Africa is. And I think that's a very important question, because we need to come from a proper foundation in order to analyze Africa and to understand it and to be able to engage with it on its own terms and as a very important part of the world. And so there are two possible interpretations of Africa as the last frontier. One interpretation is from the perspective of the expansion of the world economy to new poles of economic growth and transformation. And we've seen this in the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and we've seen it in a number of the Asian tigers. In other words, before not too long ago, the only parts of the world that were rich, essentially, were Europe and North America. But we've seen an expansion of the frontiers or spheres of prosperity to Asia especially, and to some extent to Latin America. And now the question is this frontier or this sphere extending to Africa? So that's one way in which the whole phrase, the last frontier, could be looked at. In other words, expanding frontiers of prosperity. And so is Africa now the last one that is now coming into this larger global sphere of prosperity. So that's one way to look at the phrase, the last frontier. There's another way to look at the last frontier phrase, and that is looking at Africa as a virgin new territory for conquest by the unflinching advance of globalization and global capital, operating mainly through international trade and foreign direct investment. So this is one way of looking at Africa as the last frontier. So therefore, if you're standing on the side of global capital, if you're a multinational, if you're a big business person, and you're looking at new vistas to conquer, there is some land out there. Frank McEachran, a British political philosopher in 1936, said, "There are now no new territories. There are now no new spheres to conquer. And the only room for expansion is on the moon." Now, he was writing in 1936. And at that time, I suppose, Africa did not seriously exist in his or the imagination of many people as a place for economic expansion. So, but today is very different. Lots of opportunities. And so this second meaning of the last frontier is a meaning that I am very, very wary of. And if you read my book, you will see that strain running through that book. When you look at Africa as new territory for conquest, for business opportunities, the question then becomes, in whose interest are you looking at Africa as the last frontier? If you're an investor and you are naturally a business person minded to make profit for your company or for your shareholders, that's your bottom line. You're looking at where you'll make the money. And you're not very interested in the interest or the welfare or the strategic interests of where you will make that money if you are looking at Africa as a new frontier for profits. This second meaning of Africa as the new frontier has become particularly poignant, particularly notable in light of the global financial crisis and the global economic recession that we've seen in the last 5 years, which has pulverized the traditional centers of prosperity in the world, i.e. the Western world. And so, capital will always look for where it will make profit. And so people are woken up from their comfort zone of our world as we knew it, of Europe, North America, perhaps Asia. These have become mature economies, especially in the Western world. And where are the returns now to be made? Africa, the new frontier, the last frontier. I'm wary of this perspective of Africa as the last frontier, because as an African, I must think about what is in Africa's interest. Now, that's not to say I'm against foreign direct investment. No, I'm not against global capital. I happen to be a capitalist, but I happen to be a capitalist with conscience, a capitalist with a strong dose of national self-interest embedded in my DNA. So, and as we will find, as we discuss later on, these things are not mutually exclusive. There can be win-win situations for businesses seeking opportunities and the aspirations, the legitimate aspirations of Africa and Africans. So, if you look at Africa as the last frontier from this perspective, you will also see that international trade has also seen Africa as a new opportunity because it's a rising consumer class. There's a huge shift of middle class growth in the economies of Asia, India, China, Brazil, and increasingly in Africa. And so you have a lot of people who are middle class, who have a bit more spending power, and so it's a huge consumer market for international trade. Again, the question is, when you look at this perspective of Africa as the last frontier, in whose interest is this? If you are simply a consumer, but you're not a producer, whose interest is being served? So, I leave you with that teaser for now. And then we will talk about the second part of the topic of today's discussion, and that is why Africa matters to the global economy. A, Africa could matter to the global economy as a source of extraction of raw materials and natural resources, but not as a contributor to global prosperity through its own economic transformation. This is what I call, quote unquote, negative mattering. We've mattered, quote unquote, in this manner for far too long, specifically a couple of centuries, to say the least, as a place of extraction for what fuels the prosperity of many nations, but not as a prosperous part of the world in its own right. And so, Africa has contributed or continues a trajectory that has remained fundamentally the same since the transatlantic slave trade and the period of colonial rule. This kind of mattering, the mattering of extractive importance, is the current phase of the economies of most African countries. We should also note that in this context, growth could be taking place without structural transformation taking place. And it is structural transformation that creates real prosperity. Now, even this source of importance may be in decline as we see the discovery and the rise of fracking, shale oil and gas, alternative energy sources. And so, for countries like mine, like Nigeria, for example, I mean, America used to be a major importer of Nigerian oil, but that market is being lost to shale oil and shale gas. And so we're looking eastward now. While we're looking eastward, those countries of the East are looking to fracking technology. And what happens when they alight on that technology? We're left holding the short end of the stick. So, this is one area or one type of Africa mattering to the world economy. And I talked about the whole question of growth without structural transformation. We all know what structural transformation of economies means. It means a shift away from, shall we say, resource or extraction-led activity or subsistence agriculture towards value-added manufacturing, when most of the population is employed not by agriculture, but by, productive enterprise in terms of manufacturing especially. So, and it also involves a shift away from rural areas to urban areas. We know this to be the standard definition or understanding of structural economic transformation. It doesn't mean agriculture is not important. It is and must always be. Even in the most advanced countries, agriculture is important and remains a very powerful constituency in those economies. But you will find that it is not the sector that carries the economy or most of the GDP, and it is not the sector that employs most people in the economy. But because of advances in science and technology, even however small or the numbers of people in that sector are, they produce agricultural commodities efficiently with high yielding seeds and smaller acreages producing large quantities of produce. Now that's the type of agriculture you see in advanced economies. It's not yet the type of agriculture you see in Africa, and in Africa 70% of the population is employed in agriculture. So I've talked about this one possible way in which Africa matters in the world economy. But I think the second type of mattering is that Africa should matter as a growth pole in its own right, like Asia increasingly does. For this to happen, I argue in the book I've just written that a paradigm shift must take place, because the current paradigm, which is based on unrestrained free markets, without a conceptual grasp of the opportunities, limitations, and the kinds of capitalism, and the current structure of world trade, cannot create an enabling environment for Africa to matter to the world economy in the real sense. Africa contributes 3% of world trade. 3%. 5% of total global foreign direct investment is in Africa. And when you look at these two figures, they are both very small. And so the continent still plays a negligible role in the global economy. And so the paradigm shift, this paradigm shift that I'm arguing for, must take place in the minds of Africans, first and foremost. Because I always say, Africa matters, but for whom most of all? Africa matters more than anyone else for Africans. Because Africans are God's children too, entitled to their place in the sun. And so I believe that Africa should first of all matter to them for their own sake. And there's a tendency to discuss Africa, not by Africans, but by non-Africans. And that's fine. That's a legitimate discourse as well. But Africans also should be part of the discussion, interpreting their continent, interpreting their prospects, interpreting their societies and their economies and their politics to themselves and to the world from the standpoint of an African worldview. There's too little of this happening. This book that I have written is one of the very few that I have seen. I researched what I would call competitor books when I was writing this. I mean, it's one of the things you have to submit to your publishers, a list of the competition. So I researched that, and I found out that virtually all the books that have defined, quote unquote, Africa's rise, the construction of the myth of Africa rising, has been engineered, designed, constructed almost completely by non-Africans. And so you always see, when you read a lot of these books, there are certain things they tend to focus upon. These things, to me, as an African, knowing Africa as I do, experiencing Africa as I have, having seen the world as I have, before I returned to my country, I worked in the United Nations for 17 years. I served in 5 countries, 5 duty stations in 4 continents. And so, therefore, I can say with all due humility that I have seen the world. I can say that I understand the world, not just from the perspective of Africa or of an African, but from the perspective of other peoples as well, of other races, of other parts of the world. I know and understand how they think because I have personally been immersed in these other cultures as well. And so it's very important that the paradigm shift that I'm talking about must take place in the minds of Africans. And that must be based, that paradigm shift must be based on new fundamental understandings about the world by Africans, about Africa's place in the world, about how to alter Africa's trajectory. These understandings must then be translated into better, more effective public policy, economic policy, and governance in Africa. So that then brings me to the natural question: what are these paradigm shifts that must take place for Africa to truly emerge, not just as a feel-good story, because we have made progress? Admittedly, Africa's economies, Africa's macroeconomies have stabilized and been very, very significantly improved over the past 15 years. We know that that is true. Inflation is under control in many African countries, at least well managed. Fiscal policy is significantly much better than it used to be. So there's been a huge improvement. And that huge improvement means that certain things that we had considered impossible in Africa are now possible. That's clear. The possibilities are there. Africa can indeed emerge. But what has the recent improvement, what has the recent evolution in Africa's macroeconomies been based on? Largely on a cyclical, beneficial incidence of commodities, the growth in earnings from commodities. At least a third or half of these improved economic indices owe themselves to cyclical trends in commodities. And that to me is not a sustainable rise. That to me is not a rise. That to me is a fair wind that you can latch onto to actually make sure you rise. But we haven't risen yet. Economically speaking, that is. I've given you a number of figures. So, the paradigm shifts that are necessary for Africa to truly rise, they are as follows. First of all, let's talk about globalization. Globalization, although it is a fact of economic and cultural life, is not neutral. It has drivers, it has passengers, it even has bystanders on the road. African countries cannot assume that globalization is benign in its intent or agnostic in its belief. When a careful examination will show that African countries are mostly consumers of the products of globalization. So, how Africa engages with the phenomenon of globalization will play an important role in the continent's economic trajectory in future. Now, all over Africa today, every man and his aunt, every woman and her uncle, they have a cell phone. Far more than you'll find here. And so people have come to assume that because every African has a cell phone in his pocket, Africa is rising. Oh no, not yet. Wait a minute. Let's interrogate what it means for Africa to rise. I'll come to that in a minute. So the fact that everybody's carrying an Android, a BlackBerry, some Lumina manufactured in the West or in Asia, and you feel you're with it, with globalization. You've now been connected to the whole world. And this has lulled people into a false sense of arrival, a false sense of achievement. And people are beginning to beat their chests too early. We saw this before, 50 years ago, when African countries became independent from colonial rule, and everybody in the world assumed that El Dorado had arrived, that Africans had arrived at a place of promise, and therefore all will be well hereafter. Well, 50 years later, we know the story. It's been downhill and then back uphill, which is where we are now. But we haven't moved fundamentally from where we were 50 years ago. Not when you go and look at the quality of life, Human Development Index. You look at even GDP per capita. But you see the Asian countries have moved ahead. Why? And so, much as we all understand and agree that colonialism, the colonial experience, was a major setback for Africa, yes, it was an experience built on extraction and kept Africa down for so many years. But we're not the only ones who suffered it. And if we're not the only ones who suffered it, and some of the others who suffered it are making progress, what's our excuse for not having made progress? That is why in my writing, I do not pay too much importance to the colonial experience. And so, of course, some people will accuse me and say, you're not historical enough when you look at these things. I say, yes, I'm not a historian. Let's leave that for the historians. What I do know is that in the here and now and in the future, there are certain things we need to do to make history truly history. That's where I come from. So, how Africa engages with the phenomenon of globalization is important. For you to engage with globalization effectively, you must first of all understand it. And you cannot dwell and wallow in some conventional wisdom that globalization is a win-win for everyone. It is not. There are drivers of globalization. It's driven by technology. It's driven largely by technology, which spreads culture, spreads news, spreads goods at the speed of sound or speed of light to everywhere in the world. And so it appears that nowhere in the world now is closed off, and that's good. That's also an opportunity for Africa if we know how to take advantage of that opportunity. If you don't understand that phenomenon and the forces that drive it and the purposes for which those forces drive it, you will be a consumer of the products of globalization, but you will not contribute to globalization as a producer of the goods of globalization. And so this is what I'm saying regarding globalization. Second, Africa will not matter economically until African countries become industrial manufacturing economies rather than predominantly agricultural or extractive economies. So, I've said this before, show me that part of the world that became an industrial or an economic giant without manufacturing. Show me that part of the world that became an economic giant without being an industrial society, in addition to anything else they may be. And yet we see in Africa that the share of manufacturing to GDP has consistently gone down since the 1960s. We're now becoming major mass consumer markets for globalization, and we say that Africa is rising. On this basis, no sir. So, I believe that African countries should become industrial manufacturing economies if Africa is to truly matter and to truly prosper. Third, for Africa to prosper, African countries need to develop a clear and comprehensive worldview. The crux of my book, Emerging Africa, is this question of worldviews. And that's what's different from this book and any other book you will read about the supposed rise of Africa. I discuss the importance of worldviews as a driver of transformation, as a driver of economic prosperity. Worldviews matter, and I never leave home without one in my pocket. I can tell you that. My colleagues in the UN know that. Many years ago, they knew where I stood on things. And so it's very important that you must have a view of the world. You must have an understanding of ultimate reality and human beings and the relationship between the two. It is that understanding that leads you to begin to question how you can conquer and adapt your environment. The whole question of worldviews is so fundamental. In this country, you have the worldview of manifest destiny. That's what really started and drove this country's expansion. They acquired Alaska, Hawaii, and all the other acquisitions, apart from the 13 original colonies of the Commonwealth. So, in Asia, you have that worldview. You can see it very clearly. The Chinese have a three-pronged worldview of a cyclical view of time and space, that all things are all together and ultimately connected. Stability is an end in itself, and the society matters more than the individual. That's the Chinese worldview. Now, worldviews are not that none is empirically superior to the other, except, of course, if you check the outcome. The Western worldview is based on individual liberties, the freedom of the individual. So you see a diametric opposition in the Eastern and the Western worldview. Both have delivered prosperity, because the Western worldview led to the growth of institutions. And these institutions created ultimately level playing fields for economic activity. And part of that Western worldview is accommodated in the capitalist concept of creative destruction in extreme capitalist thinking. So worldviews matter. And so I went into the book. The first part of the book, I talked about what I call the philosophical foundations of prosperity. You can't prosper if you don't have a philosophic take on prosperity. If you don't even understand prosperity, well, why do you want to prosper? And how do you want to prosper? And for what purpose? What happens when you get prosperity? How do you manage your society? How do you lead your country and your people? These are all the things that worldviews have to address. And I did some research, and I came upon a group of scholars in Belgium who have spent a lot of time just on the concept of worldviews. And that might seem a funny topic to be discussing when you're talking about economics and business and all, but I find in my research and in my own thinking that the two are fundamentally and inextricably linked. If you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where you're coming from, if you don't have a view of the world and who you are in it, why is the world the way it is? Where have we come from? What is your value system? What is your theory of action? What's the strategy? What is your theory of knowledge? There are knowledge systems. Just take medicine. You have Western medicine, classic Western medicine. You have Chinese acupuncture. You have homeopathic medicine. You have African traditional medicine. They all deliver results in different ways. They are representatives of theories of knowledge. And so, how you question what's true or false, how you assess it, matters. So these are all elements of the worldview that I think is necessary, that Africans should develop, and not always be followers of other people's worldviews. Today, it's capitalism. We're all capitalists now. Tomorrow, it's democracy. We're all Democrats. Today, it's socialism. So you keep seeing this trend, herd-driven compliance with the worldviews of someone else. African countries need to develop their own worldview so that they can take control of their narrative, take control of their own destiny. That's the only way they will succeed. One of the things that this has brought about is that you see, as I said, that everyone is a capitalist now. But in Africa, you don't have a conceptual interrogation of capitalism. There are different types of capitalism. And capitalism, although it remains, in my view, the system of economic production that has yielded the greatest benefit to mankind, for one simple reason: it addresses the fundamental human nature. And we know that not all fingers are equal. And so the rewards will go to those who have some type of superiority to others in terms of their business strategy, their business model, or whatever. But if that is the case, does it mean that those who cannot perform will perish? If you want to be extreme in your understanding of capitalism, that's the logical conclusion. But we know that that is not good for any society, because that's what you call prosperity without inclusion. And that breeds social problems, which will become economic problems at a certain point in time. So we need to interrogate capitalism. There's state capitalism, which China is using. There's crony capitalism, which is used in Russia, which is pretty much what obtains in Russia, and many countries in Africa today. There's welfare capitalism, most of Europe, especially the Nordic and Scandinavian states. And there's entrepreneurial capitalism, which is what obtains here in the United States. But none of these types of capitalism is practiced in its pure form singularly by any country. There's always some combination. Here you have entrepreneurial and as well some element of welfare capitalism. What's the debate about social security? What's the debate about welfare? You find that these are fundamental parts of the discussion in this society. So African countries need to interrogate these things and decide. Each African country for itself, the 54 countries of Africa, are not similar. They're not one country. And that's why this whole question of a worldview-driven approach to economic transformation is important, so that each country finds for itself what suits its own circumstance. And therefore, you cannot prescribe what the ultimate outcome of that trajectory will be. Now, The fourth paradigm shift that must take place, based on all the foregoing, is that the myth that Africa is rising needs some pause and some evaluation. Let us ask some fundamental questions. Yes, growth rates have been better over the past decade, but are we seeing signs of real transformation? Are manufacturing economies now the norm? Or will they likely soon be? Is growth outpacing population growth? Africa is projected to double its population by 2060. That's a scary fact. We're 1 billion now. That means we could be 2 billion by then. Is growth keeping ahead of population growth? If it is, you can create a certain prosperity from those numbers and what they can produce if their productivity is improved and made efficient. Yes. But if this doesn't happen, what you could have is a lot of social exclusion, a lot of jobs, a lot of people without jobs, and that could create social conflict. So this is the fundamental challenge that Africa is facing today as it stands at this fork at the road, where one way can lead to promise and prosperity, and one way can lead to the we've been here before, we've seen this movie before scenario. Now, what is the role of science and technology and innovation in African economies? We all know that science and technology and innovation is what grew the prosperity of the Western world. And interestingly, this is one of the areas of biggest advantage for Africans. Oh yes. I saw somebody squint. And let me tell you that Africans are the original scientists. That is the truth. History tells us that. If you look at the Pyramid of Giza, 3,800 years old, 4,000 years old, built at times when what you today know as Caucasian civilization, they were not anywhere near what those people who built those pyramids knew, or the experience, or the type of life they were living. That was built long before the Burj Khalifa, long before the Empire State Building, long before the Petronas Towers in Malaysia. Was done in Africa by Africans, Nubians. In the late 1800s, I saw a book of some European explorers observing cesarean section operations in Africa, in Uganda specifically, long before it became practiced in the Western world. These are little known things, but the problem is that the history of the world over the past 500 years has been essentially a history of the world told by one part of the world which happened to have risen in this particular epoch. And so they've written history. You know what Churchill said? History will be kind to me, he said, because I intend to write it. That's what Winston Churchill said. And that's what those who, because of science and technology, they came upon some superiority in science and technology. The manufacture of gunpowder, weapons of warfare, which they used to begin to subdue other parts of the world. Take slaves, take produce. When the slave trade became uncomfortable, could not be sustained, it was abolished, and colonialism began, because they still had to get what they were getting from the slave trade. But since they couldn't transport the human beings, they just had to go to where those people were and take what they had. So that's what colonialism was about. It was a reaction to the end of slavery. A lot of people don't know that. So this, this whole question of technology, science and technology, you find a lot of innovation going on in Africa, but there is no system whereby these brilliant kids and the things they're doing with their hands has been commercialized. People are practicing capitalism without understanding the three fundamentals of the success of capitalism. And that is, first, you must have capital. You can't have capitalism without capital. So the question of finance, how do you fund small businesses to grow, is very important. And we are addressing those questions. I'm a central banker. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about all that. That's one thing you need. The second thing is that you need innovation. The third thing is that you need property rights. Property rights must be secure for capitalism to thrive. Innovation is essential for capitalism to thrive. So these three things, are they in existence in African economies? They are not at this point, to a large extent. And that's why capitalism has worked in the West, and it's working in many parts of Asia. But it hasn't taken Africa out of poverty. And so the question is not that we should abolish capitalism. I mean, we saw a worldview battle between capitalism and communism for 80 years, which capitalism won decisively, for reasons I've explained earlier. But in practicing capitalism, we must be intelligent about it to make it work for us. Capitalism must work for Africans, not just work in Africa because somebody has told you to liberalize all your markets, become democrats, and all will be well. We've done that, and all is not well. So, fifth, so the whole question of science and technology, to conclude that point, is one strong advantage that Africans have, because if Africans were to channel their penchant and their ability for innovation, for scientific inventions, in the proper manner, one of the structural consequences of that will be that Africa can break out of the vice grip of globalization. Oh yes. When they develop homegrown appliances that are commercialized, you engage and enter globalization on your own terms. You don't enter and engage with globalization on somebody else's terms. The person who's driving that force of globalization. And you're on your phone talking to your friend and you say, we're all very hip. But you didn't manufacture the phone. You just bought it. You're making somebody else very wealthy. So much so in Nigeria that Research in Motion, RIM, banked on Nigeria for its survival. Oh yes, there's a film in Nigeria called Blackberry Babes. Oh, I'm telling you. Very popular movie. You know? So ubiquitous are these devices in Nigeria. So part of the popular culture, so part of the everyday. But you benefit because you've broken down distances. Yes, you can communicate and things are moving faster. But the ultimate person who's getting really wealthy is not you. It's the person who made it. So that's the point I'm making. Through science and technology, we can re-enter, re-engage with globalization from a standpoint of some strength. Now, the fifth paradigm shift that must take place is that African countries must move towards economic diversification and economic complexity. Very, very important. Economic complexity and diversification. African economies are fundamentally, as I said in the beginning, extractive economies. African states are still, to a large extent, extractive states. And this is not unique to Africa. There are a lot of other countries in the world that are monoproduct economies, especially the countries that produce oil. The difference between African oil-producing countries and oil-producing countries in other parts of the world is that oil-producing countries in other parts of the world have made provision for the rainy day. They have reinvested their earnings from oil in different ways. They have huge sovereign wealth funds that provide for their future. But in Africa, you rarely see this. We just established a sovereign wealth fund in Nigeria just about a year or two ago, after a lot of politically contentious debate. Why is that? So, we must move towards producing value-added things, things with economic insight, with quality and specialization embedded in them. That's why Singapore is wealthy. There's nothing under the soil in Singapore. That's why Switzerland is wealthy. I could find nothing under the streets of Geneva in the 7 years I lived there. Never touched oil. Never touched any mineral. South Korea, same thing. Japan, same thing. These countries were able to understand and practicalize economic complexity to produce things in a competitive manner. Africa can do this too. And Africa must do this too for Africa to prosper. Because when you are a monoproduct economy, when you are essentially an extractive economy, all the action takes place at what one writer called the gate. Where is the gate? The gate is where those minerals or that oil is found. It becomes the scene of the action. And everything about governance in that country revolves around the gate, quote unquote. Because that's where people get rich. And when you control that resource, a few people can get wealthy, but the masses will never be rich. And so if you don't move away from this type of economic, factor productivity, we have land, we have a huge population, we have oil, we have agriculture. These things are not the basis of transformation. And so we must move away from factor endowment thinking in Africa to economic complexity. We must manufacture the consent of the citizens of African countries, their consent to clear visions and strategies for economic transformation. Absolutely essential. Walt Lippmann called it here in this country the manufacture of consent. It's an American term from a great American propagandist. Oh yes. This country was built on a certain amount of propaganda. But that's necessary to focus the minds of citizens and to channel the energy of a mass of people in one direction that is clearly defined and understood. That's what China has done in the past 30 years. That's what this country and many Western countries did years ago. You can't avoid it. You can't not do it. You must manufacture consent. And so you have in many African countries today divisive and vociferous tendencies, ethnicity, religion, all this. And everything is still assessed through the prism of all that. These countries, America went through it, Europe went through it. But why must we spend another 200 years going through it just because some other person did? No, I don't believe in making mistakes that you can see how to avoid. People will say that as an excuse. Well, we're too hard on ourselves. Do you know how long it took Europe to become what they are today? Do you know how long it has taken the United States? Sorry, I'm not impressed. Tell that to the Chinese. Tell that to the Singaporeans. Tell that to the Malaysians who are not waiting to find out. That's where Africa should be going. And then finally, we need strong institutions. We need to build institutions in Africa. So based on these perspectives, I think that African countries need to evaluate commonly held assumptions about globalization, commonly held assumptions about foreign aid. Oh, don't start me off on foreign aid. Commonly held assumptions on free markets, commonly held assumptions on foreign investment, and so forth, if they are to prosper. This is why I wrote Emerging Africa. I wrote it to decode and address the real factors that have held Africa back and the secrets of prosperity that Africans need to understand and apply in order to prosper, rather than merely repeating conventional wisdoms that have not brought about a fundamental change of circumstance in the African condition. Thank you.
Well, Carl, that's a hard act to follow. Carl, again, is assistant professor of school international service at American University. Dr. Levan has widely published works on power sharing in East Africa, democratization, and civil society in Nigeria. Works with us closely at the Niger Delta Working Group and other things. So, Carl, welcome. And we're going to have to limit you to about 10 minutes.
In that case, I'll talk fast. Thanks for inviting me, Steve, and Mr. Moghalu. I certainly look forward to reading your book, and I look forward to reflecting on it in the next 10 minutes. And I'm also grateful for the assistance the central bank provided me when I was doing research some years ago for my own work. And the central bank has played a really important role in getting Nigeria's economy on track in the last 10 years. And if one needs a quick shortcut for understanding what that looks like, just look at what the money supply numbers for the 1990s and the inflation numbers for the 1980s, and it's quite compelling. So I want to start by reflecting upon Africa as the last frontier and why Africa matters to the global economy and some of the calls for a paradigm shift that Moghalu outlined. And then I want to reflect a little bit on where I think we are in Washington and within economic thinking more broadly in terms of some of the things that he said. And you opposed two different views of Africa as the last frontier. One that situates it with an expanding global economy, and an alternate view, perhaps, which says that it's sort of the target of conquest by capital. And there's certainly a tension and a transformation, I think, generationally already happening within Africa and among the young Africans who I talk to all the time, seeing and interpreting some of that experience differently. So I think it's really exciting that your book picked up on both the need for that and on an interpretive presence in this generational shift about how Africans are interpreting and understanding some of the changes going on. Within that global economy, one of the more interesting empirical reflections that I stumbled on some years ago was when the global economic crisis began unfolding in 2009 to 2010, that the weak integration of Africa into the global economy in many ways insulated it, ironically, from the global economic crash. And so what that means is that what that leaves us with today, 2013 in Africa, is a series of opportunities. And I think it's really important, as you're pointing out and as you're arguing, to reflect on what those opportunities are and what they are not. In terms of the raw materials and the extraction, what we're seeing in Africa now is that in the last 10 years, an increasing number of countries have experienced massive per capita GDP economic growth, and more of those countries were not simply oil producers. What the new oil producers coming online in the next couple of years tell us, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, is that they will provide an experiment about what oil production looks like after the governance revolution and post the 1990s democratization. So what will it mean to have a massive new influx of revenue going to central governments, but then has to be democratically reallocated somehow? And this is why your second point about the need for structural transformation to get to prosperity is really important. And you were absolutely right to hit on the economic diversification and the need for economic diversification. And I'll say something about industrialization in a moment. The reason why this is important is because commodity booms have been cyclical, as you pointed out, and economic diversification will provide some sort of insulation from negative shocks of prices going down, as well as positive shocks with the prices going up. Inflation in Nigeria in the 1970s went through the roof, partly because of the distortion of the currency and loss of that element of control. But this also becomes important because it economic diversification of the economy overall helps disperse wealth, and it disperses wealth through market mechanisms rather than through the way it's often distributed in the industrialized world, which is through progressive taxation. Having said that, there is, of course, a surprising variation in taxation and the capacity for taxation emerging across Africa and even within Nigeria today. The agricultural sector, as you point out, is not high yield in Africa. And the contrast that I always make is that in the U.S. you have less than 3% of the population engaged in agricultural production, and the U.S. produces a surplus. It's exporting food. And then in Africa you have over 2/3 of the population involved in some sort of agricultural activity with much, much lower yields and often with people hungry. So, and part of the problem is that there's a high cost of economic integration even within the regional mechanism. So how do the people who are producing food get it to people who might want to buy the food? And technology has helped tremendously in some of those sectors. A few months ago, I was in New York City and met with a CEO of a company that's helping market traders in the border of Mozambique identify buyers and sellers at the small local level of just women who do nothing but cross the border back and forth in order to solve some of those transaction costs and to try to increase the volume of trade for people working at the very, very micro level. So anytime anybody mentions a paradigm shift, I think of Thomas Kuhn, and what he told us about paradigms and paradigm shifts is that things don't change incrementally when you're talking about paradigms. They change in a revolutionary sense all at once, where the old order is upturned, in much the way that colonialism and the end of colonialism upturned an old order. And so what are the ingredients beyond the feel-good story? I think it's really important to comment and think about your observation that globalization is not neutral and cannot be taken as benign. And the reason why that resonates with me today is because that exact comment and that question was at the center of the debates over the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act when it was subject to a vigorous and lively debate that I was a part of in the U.S. Congress in 1998 and 1999. And what was different about the AGOA debate then and the AGOA debate now is that the AGOA debate was embedded within a broader conversation about development. And it was also embedded, of course, in a critique of aid, and the slogan, of course, was trade, not aid. And since then, there have been a few important changes. One is a fourfold increase in overall trade between U.S. and Africa, volume going both directions, some shift in the natural resources, that I already mentioned, and also a much, much stronger emphasis on governance. And what the governance reform, I think, tells us, and the thinking about governance from the World Bank, from scholars, from governments, from civil society, is that policy needs to be bigger than any one leader. And the problem is that leaders, I think, sometimes often get the praise. And if you leave policy simply to a leader, then it's hard for policy to become stable. And if it's difficult for policy to become stable, then investors don't feel confident. And that's why policy has to actually have some sort of stickiness to it in order to really matter. Within this context of economic growth and the rising consumer class, there's also a question of the shifting political interests of the rising consumer class. And so if you have about 20 or 22 economies that over the last 10 years have sustained 4 or 5% economic growth GDP, almost all of them without natural resource revenue, then what you're getting is you're getting a new middle class. And what we need to start thinking about is how that middle class will communicate their economic interests, their social interests, and their cultural values to governments who are making this policy, formulating the investment environment. And I would push back a little bit on how those citizens would react to the manufacturing of consent, which was Walter Lippmann's phrase, and that was a gateway into the public relations revolution 80 years ago in the United States, which it certainly did drive a great deal of marketing. The public relations and marketing for products are very, very closely related, but I think it's very difficult to manufacture consent and simultaneously cultivate good citizens. And so I think that's something that will remain part of the tension between politics and economics and policy in sorting through this. The idea of taking control of the narrative certainly to me invoked Cabral and many of the things, and I'm sure you read fondly at LSE. And And industrialization and manufacturing have been tried before in Africa. And you're absolutely right that value added is the way to go. And in some places, industrialization is unquestionably going to be a part of that. But the interesting thing about emphasizing industrialization now and thinking about how the wealthy countries got wealthy is that those wealthy countries are now shifting away from industrialization, that they're all largely post-industrial economies. And even within Nigeria, as you well know, where diversification of the economy has occurred and where the growth has occurred just in the last 5, 6, 7 years is within the service sector and not necessarily within the manufacturing sector. So this is something that's really interesting. And so, one question is, does that deindustrialization or the post-industrialization of the West, does it present an opportunity actually for Africa to pick up some of that slack? Or should some of those countries be looking at some of those other sectors of growth, like the service sector, and really thinking hard about how industrialization was pursued previously through ISI, import substitution industrialization, and through central planning, because it's very difficult to use commodity wealth to finance industrialization, which is typically how many of these economies, even as they have marketized, hoped to accomplish some sort of industrial revolution on its own African terms. And briefly, I'm probably running out of time. The Asian model is important, is interesting, has much to teach us, but I think it's sometimes fetishized. And Yakubu Gowon, who ruled Nigeria for 8 years, told me in 2010, I wish we had leaders who had the good insights of Singaporean leaders. And, empirically, we can now say that there's almost no distinction between democracies and dictatorships when you're comparing economic growth rates and only looking at economic growth. However, once you look past economic growth and per capita GDP and those big macroeconomic numbers, there are lots of differences in terms of quality of life, in terms of human capital investment, in terms of resource allocation. And so there are major distinctions, and to the extent that we push the Asian comparison, I think the political impacts were already felt across South Korea in the 1980s as South Korea went through its own democratization, and in other countries I think it's still moving forward. And so when we think about the revolution in China or elsewhere, if we're going to think about it in those longer terms, then I think we have to think about what the long-term politics will be after the short-term economics. And I think the way I characterize the comparison is that I think you're very insightful to hit upon capitalism and the varieties of capitalism. And I think capitalism varies based on how governments and societies respond to market failures. I mean, one of the most important critiques of conventional and neoclassical economics in the last 20 or 30 years has been this sort of rebellion about markets not failing. And what I mean by that is failing in terms of their resource allocation. So I think I'll back off from that and perhaps inject one or two other ideas during the question and answer. I know the Washington audience, even in August, can get very lively because there are a few other things that I think are really important to reflect on, including property rights and some of these other calls that you mentioned. So thank you for your provocative comments and your thoughtful analysis, and I really look forward to reading the book.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl, and appreciate your discipline there, because I know it was hard. And I know that he threw a couple of challenges and questions at you, Kingsley, but let's go ahead and open it to the floor and gather a lot of that before you begin to make any response. And Carl, of course, you're welcome to join in on responding anytime. So the rules are simple, as you all know. Wait for the microphone and identify yourself so you're picked up on the broadcast. And so the first hand I saw was here, second hand is here, third hand is over here.
Hello, My name is Winslow Robertson, and I run a China-Africa Research Network here in D.C. And one of the things I wanted to ask Deputy Director Moghalu is specifically in terms of the sometimes triumphalist China and Africa narrative. As someone who works in central banks, the use of the renminbi in trade and investing money in the renminbi as capital, does that signal a fundamental shift away in terms of financial thinking for African governments? This is something South Africa is doing, I believe Nigeria is doing, and other African governments are doing as well. Does this signal a fundamental shift in thinking and perhaps a retreat from U.S.-dominated global finance?
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador Hagag. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kingsley. My name is Hagag. I'm from Egypt, Cairo, Africa Society. I listened very carefully to your impressive presentation, and thank you very much for exploring the prospects in Africa. Could you enlighten us about, you spoke a lot about international investments in Africa and how we have only 3% of world trade and so on. Could you explore the prospects of African investments in Africa itself? I served in Africa for a long time, and I found that Africans are not welcoming other African investments in their country. And we experimented with a lot of economic integration experiments. We are late in copying other experiments in the world, but we have a lot of bottlenecks in allowing inter-African trade in spite of all those integration process. We have better access to former colonial powers. Inter-African trade is between 5 and 10%. And you have to also to mention the cultural aspect in Africa. As you mentioned, we have 54 African countries. We look at ourselves as one body, but when it comes to culture, it's diversified. With due respect, I don't want you to be disheartened. Your book will be read better in the West and the United States. It will be reviewed here more, understood, more than in Africa itself. I try to rectify this when coming home. I will make some reviews about your very impressive book. Thank you.
Thank you. And right over to Pauline.
Pauline Baker from the Fund for Peace. First of all, I want to thank you for a very refreshing, very interesting, very interesting talk. But what was striking to me is that in your list of transformations that had to be made, you didn't address the issue of corruption and good governance. And by good governance, I don't just mean the democratization that Carl was referring to, which tends to be defined as elections. I mean good governance in the sense of good management. And I wonder how much you think that the perception, at least, of endemic corruption and the lack of good governance is an inhibitor to the transformations that you were calling for.
Okay, thank you. I think that gives us quite a smorgasbord for you to begin to pick on, including the points that Carl brought up on post-industrial society and,
absolutely.
Service. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Is this on?
Yes, it is.
Oh, yeah. Oh, great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carl, for very excellent remarks on my presentation. I'd like to start with your comment about deindustrialization and the post-industrialization of Western society, and whether or not this, presents some type of opportunity for Africa. That's a very important point. Now, yes, we are in a post-industrial society in the United States. We've seen the rise of 3D manufacturing and things like that. I mean, you can sort of punch some box and it will manufacture a teacup. But it's yet to be seen whether this will drive the traditional makers of teacups out of business, or whether it will be a very interesting hobby for those who can afford to manufacture teacups in their living rooms. But yes, the post-industrial society in the West is real. But that's because they can be post-industrial because first they have been industrial, in my view. I don't see some people, some thinking in Africa talked about a quantum leap, a jump across the stages of development, straight to, it was fashionable in the 90s to talk about Africans jumping to prosperity on the basis of information technology, when computers and internet and all that was coming out. And it's a very important, information and communication technology is a very important component of economic prosperity. And the service industries that cluster around it can be very, very good. But I still hold the view, that while it is possible, for example, for small countries to build economies that are based on services, Rwanda, for example, is trying to do that. They are very, very active in IT. They want to become the Singapore of Africa and so on. But I doubt how effective or how possible this will be for countries that have much larger populations, and many countries in Africa are in this situation, to develop without becoming manufacturing societies. I have my serious doubts, and my response to that is that you can only become post-industrial after you've become industrial. And if you look at the challenge that Africa has in terms of unemployment, Africa has 21% unemployment rates today. What will give jobs to those teeming masses of youth in Africa, is what we have to be thinking about for Africa. We cannot look to the West and its post-industrial society as a model for us. We must first provide jobs for our people. And the post-industrial society will not produce the kind of jobs that an industrial society will produce. So our aspiration at this point, realistically speaking, I said in the book that Africa should make some clear choices about whether it will become an end product, consumer goods, whether it will become, a self-sufficient player in the global economy, or whether it will become a dominant actor. It's not realistic at this point to expect Africa to become a dominant actor, but it is realistic to expect Africa to become self-reliant, to a large extent, part of the world economy. And that is why we cannot jump in Africa to a post-industrial state, in my view.
Part of Carl's question, I think, was does the post-industrialization of the West open opportunities for Africa in industrialization?
Oh, actually, I think it can, but for that to happen, there are certain things that must happen in Africa itself. Yeah. We see this in China. China is moving away now up the value chain, away from light manufacturing. They're moving more into the heavy-duty things, and they're educating themselves for that. Now, there is the possibility then that a lot of that light manufacturing could come to Africa. Now, but for that to come to Africa, there are two there are two location factors that must be present. One is that Africa must have the correct skill space. This is absolutely important. We have to have the skills. We have to have very good educational systems in Africa in order to be able to attract the type of foreign investment that will actually serve Africa's strategic interest, and in order to be able to take advantage of the post-industrialization of any society in the West or the East. And so part of the strategy I discuss in the book is in the chapter on foreign investment is that African states must take control of foreign investment policy and strategy and factor in their national interest in it, and therefore direct foreign investment to the areas that are truly in their own national priority interest, not according to the priorities of foreign investors, who, for example, in Nigeria today, a lot of them are making, a killing from portfolio investments in Nigeria, precisely because the monetary policy rate at this point in time is reasonably high. And when you have the quantitative easing going on here, with the obvious objective of keeping interest rates low for the time being, and so of course portfolio managers move their money in a search for yield to where they will make money, and so you have a lot of those people in Nigeria today. Now, that is a Faustian bargain, as I have said. As a member of our monetary policy committee at the central bank, we've discussed these types of things and said, well, because Nigeria doesn't have a diversified economy, the exchange rate of the naira for now is everything. And the stability of the exchange rate is important because it's an import-dependent economy, and an importation becomes a pass-through channel for inflation. So you have to keep the currency stable for the economy to be stable.
Mm-hmm.
For you to keep the currency stable, you have to ensure significant inflows of foreign capital that bring foreign reserves and foreign exchange. Mm-hmm. So you see these kinds of things. So we need to do some fundamental things first before we can benefit from the advantages or the opportunities of a post-industrial society in the West and in China. You talked about, Carl, the Asian model and how it is sometimes fetished. Mm-hmm. That may be, but you see, as I say, there's no particular superiority of worldviews, except, of course, you look at the output or the outcomes of those worldviews. And I think that if you look at the outcomes of the Chinese worldview and the Asian worldview and the rise of Asia and what is called the Asian century, I think the fact, as we say in law, res ipsa loquitur, the fact speaks for itself. The fact is...
Again, there's no empirical distinction between the economic performance of dictatorships and democracies in global terms.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. No, that's true. But the point I was trying to make is that, I agree with you there, but the point I'm trying to make is that both the Asian model and the Western model, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with those models. One model may be wrong from the perspective of one worldview, but that's precisely the point I'm making, that there is a clash of worldviews out there. And what's Africa's worldview? You're just swallowing somebody else's worldview. Today they're telling you democracy is the best thing since sliced bread. A lot of people are Democrats, but they're hungry.
Sitting rather than sliced bread.
Yeah, so that's one fact of the matter. So the question, the argument becomes: has democracy, is it good and essential for its own sake, or is there some argument that it can help to lead to prosperity? The point you make confirms that. It's neither here nor there. Mm-hmm. So if you want to pursue democracy, be clear that you're pursuing democracy because you think democracy is a good thing, not because you think it's going to make you any wealthier than a dictatorship, because a lot of dictatorships have also become very wealthy. Mm-hmm. That's the fact of the matter. Yes. Now, to address a couple of other questions, China, Africa, use of renminbi, foreign investment in Africa. My book will be better read in the West than in Africa. I have a lot to say about that. And omission of governance and corruption. Yeah. So I want to address those questions very quickly. First of all, on China and Africa and the use of renminbi. As a central banker, of course, Nigeria was the first central bank in Africa, I believe, to turn to using the renminbi as a portion of our foreign reserves. And this is a reflection of the evolving reality of international finance and the outcomes of China's rise as an economic power. The truth of the matter is that China has become very alluring and very appealing as an economic power to many developing countries. And so many countries now want to be in a position. Of course, we all know it's only a matter of time before the Chinese currency becomes fully convertible. And when you look at the Chinese worldview and their extreme adeptness at strategy, you can see that they know where they're going and they know how exactly they're going to get there. And they want to manage the process of internationalizing or converting the renminbi without the disadvantages of having a convertible currency. Because at the end of the day, there is a political worldview that underlies economic processes in China. And so they never separate the two. And that's why they could do something as oxymoronic as having capitalism with state characteristics. Or with Chinese characteristics, as they say, So, yes, I think it does signify a shift in financial thinking in Africa, and I think a lot of countries that have trade with China, because trade between African countries and China has been increasing in massive leaps. Africa's trade with China as at end of 2012 was about $200 billion, and that's just massive quantum leaps from a few years ago, and that's only set to grow. And that's a different debate in itself about our relationship with China, which I devote part of a chapter to in my book. And I think that will be very interesting. But speaking about the book, let me jump to the question of my book will be better read in the West than in Africa. Very important and insightful comment. Now, some people say, I don't agree, so don't quote me, that if you want to keep anything from an African, put it in a book. Now, this is an extreme way of saying that the reading culture has declined, but it wasn't always so. And so that shows that it's not necessarily the intrinsic nature of Africans not to read. I mean, paper was invented in Egypt. So, you know, Africa has had its share of scholars and global scholars and their contributions to global thinking in terms of especially culture. You know, Chinua Achebe, who passed away recently, was one of the greatest and most influential African writers in the world, and so on. But as part of my worldview, which I told you I never leave home without a copy in my pocket, I decided that this book will be published by an African publisher. My previous two books, one was published by Stanford University Press, another one was published by Palgrave Macmillan. They all circulate in the West, but you can't find them in Abuja. Nobody knows, nobody cares. So I said to myself, having now been converted to this new question of worldviews, should I now write another book and first of all rush to go and publish it in the West? No. I answered the question in the negative. Why? Because the first and the most important constituency that I think should read my book is Africans themselves. So that our minds, I argue in this book, that nothing short of the reinvention of the African mind will make Africa prosper. And that's why the battle is in the mind and for the mind. In your public diplomacy here, you call it a battle for hearts and minds. It's in a different way, but that's what is also going on. It's a battle for the African mind. And that mind must be transformed. That mind must see the world in a different way and see Africa in the world in a different way if Africa is to develop. There's no ism, there's no amount of theory that will make Africa rise and be transformed economically if Africa's paradigm perceptions do not change. And that is why the most fundamental aspect of the development journey begins in the mind. But a lot of economic discourse does not discuss this. And that's why my book is unique, in my view. Forgive me for, you know. So that's the point. You know, I start from where it matters most. Also, being an African myself and having seen that reality. So I decided that the book will be published by an African publisher. Now, I have done this fully knowing that it does create some disadvantages. Why? Because you may go to Amazon.com, you may not be able to see the book. If you go to Amazon.co.uk, it's there. Yeah? And if you want to order it directly from the publisher, it's there. But there are logistical problems because of this whole question of integration with the global economy and so on. And so, of course, to address that problem, you know, I mean, in 2014, there will be a version of this book, hopefully, from Yale University Press, which will be everywhere. But it doesn't matter to me. I mean, I've done what, for me, mattered most, which was to write to Africans, first and foremost. And so, of course, we had an event in Nigeria where, you know, we sort of unveiled the book. Because if all the people in the West read this book and appreciate it, and all the people who are making policy in Africa don't read it and appreciate it, nothing changes. You just have better educated and better informed Westerners, and Africans know worse off and know better off than they were before. So I decided to address this question, sir. So that's why I've gone through the route that I've gone, publishing it first with an African publisher, and then later on it can be published more globally. Just to address this point. And we're going to hopefully be having a number of these kinds of discussions about the book in Africa as well. Now, to the question on foreign investment and African investments in Africa, it might interest you to know that over the last few years, a full 30% of the increases in foreign investment in Africa have come from intra-African investments. I want to tell you, sir, I want to give you good news that this is actually a rising tide. It's led by companies such as the South African conglomerates, which are expanding heavily into other sub-Saharan African countries. You have MTN, the mobile phone, and several others. You have ShopRite, the consumer goods conglomerate. You have also the Nigerian magnate, Dangote, Aliko Dangote, who's manufacturing cement and a number of other products. And he's got manufacturing plants now in about 14 different countries in Africa. So there is a serious rise in a lot of Nigerian businessmen now who are very smart are looking in the continent for opportunities. Nigerian banks have almost colonized the rest of the continent, in terms of banking subsidiaries and all that. And it was when they went to other countries with their sharp suits and, elegant service orientations that the staid banking cultures in those countries were faced with the choice to either conform or die. And so they had to now shape up to the Nigerian bankers. And so that's how banking in many African countries now is really developing in terms of modernity and service availability because of what Nigerian banks investing in other African countries have done. So there is a significant shift in that direction. The omission of governance and corruption in the discussion. Yes, I discuss it in the book. It was not my intention to omit it. It must have been an oversight. But I think governance failure has actually been the most important problem of the post-independence African state. And that's the reason why Africa hasn't fundamentally, but I go a level beneath that, because these are normal discourses. Yes, governance failure. Oh, yes, corruption. But why the governance failure? Why the corruption? And you come back to the whole question of the absence of worldviews. Because if you have a proper worldview, which is the responsibility in a developing country, in my view, of leadership to inculcate through the educational system and other ways, if you don't have that conception of why a worldview is important, you will not be able to come at governance with the seriousness that will create prosperity. You will see governance, as it happens in many African states, as a question of who's got control of the gate. And that's what has happened in too many African countries for far too long, because of the colonial legacy of extraction. And so the post-independence African state continued its economic model along the path of extraction, the gatekeeper states. And so governance came to revolve around the gate. So that's the problem. But the only thing that can dislodge this reality is building this new worldview. And so I decided, while recognizing governance failure and while recognizing corruption, which is a symptom of a failure or the absence of one of the 7 core components of a worldview, and that is a value system. Every worldview builds a value system in it. In the West it is so, and in Asia it is so. So Africa has its own African value systems, very valid concepts of morality and how to live and how to relate with each other and the state and all that. But because there is no commonly identifiable worldview, you don't have this type of discussion going on. And so people have not been inoculated against the natural fallout of the extractive state, which is corruption and the resource cost. So governance, very important problem. Corruption, very important problem. But I'm saying you have to go one level below in order to be able to address these problems. And that's one of the ways I address the matter in the book. You have to see corruption, we in Africa have to see corruption as a strategic risk to our existence. We have, in this book, I also have a chapter on risk management and strategy. Again, one of the reasons why this book is very different, because I say how, the path to transformation. How do you develop a strategy of statecraft and public policy? How do you develop risk management systems that prevent us from falling into the usual traps, and how do we manage those things? So very valid point, corruption, governance failure. But 2 things are very essential to address the question of governance failure. It's not enough to have good leaders or just wish for good leaders. We need to have active, good followers. There's a big problem with followership in Africa. Everybody's talking about the leadership, but the followers are terrible. I'm sorry, because they just don't demand for their right to be governed properly. There's too much. People just sit back and accept, bad governance, and feel that, once they can survive on their own in the daily struggle, that's okay. But that's because there is no worldview. If there is a worldview, people begin to think larger than themselves. And so you will begin to have coalitions that will demand accountability of leadership in African countries. Accountability is critical because there is no good, there are no people who are inherently good or some people who are inherently bad. I had an example of this in Geneva, Switzerland. One day when I was driving in Geneva, and I came to a traffic light, and the camera that takes pictures of traffic violations, everything for some reason broke down. And I was wondering, was I in Lagos or was I in Geneva? Because everybody was tooting their horn, which you rarely hear in Geneva, and everybody was trying to find his way out. And it was bedlam, the kind of traffic situations you find in a lot of underdeveloped countries. Why was this happening in Geneva, Switzerland? Simply because the tool of accountability had broken down. And everybody could see that that tool of accountability wasn't there. And so their natural selves came out.
Oh, those Swiss.
No, I'm sorry. This is how it is everywhere in the world. The only thing that keeps people on track is just knowing that if you mess up, you could get punished. And that's the same for Americans as it is for Europeans as it is for Africans. And that's why it's important to develop accountability in African societies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have actually gone well beyond our time already, so let me turn to the guy who really controls things here. Derek, can we go any further, or need we wrap this up?
I'm getting told that we have to wrap it.
We've been told to wrap it up. Okay, I'm sorry. We're 15 minutes over time, and of course, we have schedules in this building. We had some Twitter followers who'd given us questions too, which we'll just have to apologize to them for not getting to. But the reason I let it go on is because this was so fascinating. Just a brilliant presentation and bringing such unique views and perspectives from what we usually hear. So I'm sorry to the audience that we didn't get more questions and answers. I'm sure that Kingsley probably will leave the building slowly and give you a little chance to dialogue with him.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Join me in thanking both of our presenters today. Wonderful session.